Imagine standing right at the base of the Burj Khalifa, or maybe even in front of the Pentagon.
Oh, wow. Yeah, just massive, imposing structures.
Right. You are looking up at this absolute behemoth of steel, glass, and impenetrable concrete. And a guy standing next to you casually points at it and says, not a single piece of this will be left standing tomorrow.
It is just an unthinkable statement.
Exactly. He says it is all coming down. That is exactly the kind of reality-shattering bombshell we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive.
It is going to be a fascinating one.
Before we really get into the heavy stuff, I just want to extend a divine blessing for your day and honestly for your entire week ahead. May you find incredible clarity, profound peace, and a real sense of purpose in whatever you're facing right now.
That is a wonderful way to start.
Thanks. So today we have a massive mission. We are taking an immersive journey into Mark chapter 13. Historically, this is known as the Olivet Discourse.
Yes, and we have some phenomenal source material in front of us today to help unpack it.
We really do. We are digging into the deep historical context, the Greek word studies, and these absolutely stunning architectural diagrams from the Holman and NAA Study Bibles. They really bring the first century world to life.
It is arguably one of the most complex texts to explore, because what really strikes you right out of the gate is the sheer scale of the contrast here.
Right. How so?
Well, this whole discourse begins with a casual, almost tourist-like moment. A few guys just marveling at some very impressive ancient masonry.
And just taking in the sights.
Exactly. But within minutes, that conversation accelerates into a terrifying prophecy. We are talking cosmic collapse, global deception, and the ultimate fate of humanity.
So let's set the scene and figure out how we get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
We are in the first century. Jesus and his disciples are walking out of the temple complex in Jerusalem.
Right.
And one of the disciples basically looks around and says, look at these massive stones. Look at these magnificent buildings.
And honestly, looking at these architectural layouts we have here, the disciple was absolutely not exaggerating.
Not at all. I mean, Herod the Great's temple was, without exaggeration, an absolute marvel of the ancient world.
It really was. When you dig into the historical context, this complex had been under continuous construction for about 50 years by the time this conversation takes place.
50 years. That is a lifetime.
Right, and the sheer footprint is just hard to comprehend. The Temple Mount occupied roughly 140,000 square meters.
Wow. Wait, that is a huge chunk of the city, right?
Yeah, it is about 1/6 of the entire area of the city of Jerusalem at the time. It wasn't just a building. It was the absolute, undeniable epicenter of their universe.
Religiously, culturally, economically, all of it.
Exactly.
And these weren't just standard bricks they were stacking. The foundation stones were gigantic. We were talking about stones that were up to 18 meters long and 4 meters high.
The scale of that is just wild.
To put that in perspective for you, a single stone could weigh an astonishing 450 tons. That is like trying to stack fully loaded Boeing 747s on top of each other.
I mean, think about the logistical nightmare of ancient engineering. Required just to quarry and move one of those stones, let alone elevate them to create this sprawling complex.
Right, and the diagrams paint such a vivid picture of how imposing it was. On the southern end, you had the royal portico.
Oh, yeah. That structure was massive.
It spanned 278 meters and featured 4 rows of 40 massive Corinthian columns. And this space was actually where the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, held their official meetings.
When I look at this layout, the infrastructure connecting everything is just mind-blowing. You have the Wilson Arch, which functioned as this massive elevated highway bridge over the Tyropean Valley.
Yeah, a literal highway bridge in the ancient world.
Yeah, exactly. And the Robinson Arch, which held these enormous monumental staircases leading right up to the royal portico. The whole thing was designed to make you feel small.
It definitely would have. And then, right in the middle of it all, you have the Soreg.
Right, the Soreg.
This was a strict physical barrier, basically a stone fence, that explicitly kept unpurified Gentiles or non-Jews out of the inner courtyards.
So the architecture itself was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It physically reinforced the religious and social hierarchy of the day.
Yeah, it told you exactly where you belonged.
But it also reinforced a suffocating political reality. Looming directly over the temple complex was the fortress Antonia.
Oh, man. The Roman garrison.
Exactly. This was a Roman military garrison positioned there specifically to command the area, ostensibly to protect the temple, but fundamentally to crush any religious riots the second they sparked.
It is literally a sword hanging over the holiest site in Judaism. You have the holiest space, and casting a shadow over it is the military might of Rome, just daring you to step out of line.
The tension must have been incredibly thick.
It really must have been. So you have this backdrop of seemingly invincible permanence,
Yeah.
450-ton stones, deeply entrenched religious structures, and the looming threat of the Roman military machine.
Right. And against that specific backdrop, Jesus drops the bombshell.
He looks at this impenetrable masonry and says, not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down.
It completely shatters their sense of reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because to the disciples, the destruction of the temple was entirely synonymous with the end of the world. Those two concepts were identical to them.
Exactly. If the temple falls, reality as we know it is over.
Which perfectly explains their immediate reaction, or I guess their lack of one. They don't immediately start interrogating him in the middle of a crowded temple courtyard.
No, the psychological shock is way too heavy for that.
Right, so they wait, they walk in silence, they cross the Kidron Valley, and they climb up the Mount of Olives.
That geographical move is so important to visualize. The Mount of Olives sits about 91 meters above Jerusalem.
Okay, so pretty significant elevation.
Yes. So Jesus sits down with Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and they have this spectacular panoramic view looking right back down at the temple complex.
They're literally staring at the doomed buildings from a bird's eye view.
It is a profoundly dramatic staging. And from this private vantage point, looking at the city, these four disciples finally ask two very specific, desperate questions.
Which are,
They ask, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?
well, yeah. If you've just been told the center of your universe is going to be annihilated, you are desperately going to want a warning system.
Exactly. You need to know the when and the how.
And this is where the text gets notoriously complicated, right? Because Jesus' answer introduces what scholars call a dual timeline dilemma.
Yes, he intricately intertwines two totally separate events.
Okay, break that down for us.
On one hand, he is talking about the immediate future, specifically the brutal destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD by the Roman general Titus.
Right, the local historical event.
But on the other hand, he is talking about the ultimate final end of the world. And the text constantly blurs the lines between the two.
So how do you even begin to read that? Is this like looking at a massive mountain range from distance?
Oh, that is a great way to picture it.
Yeah, because when you are miles away, two giant mountain peaks look like they're right next to each other, almost perfectly overlapping. But once you actually hike closer, you realize there is a massive valley of time between the first peak, the year 70 AD, and the second peak, the actual end of the world.
That is the perfect analogy. From their vantage point on the Mount of Olives, the disciples are seeing both peaks as one continuous event.
Wow.
Jesus is answering both of their questions, but the timeline stretches centuries further than they realize. And interpreters have tried to untangle this in a few different ways.
Let's walk through the mechanics of those interpretations, because it really shapes how you view the rest of the chapter, right?
It absolutely does. Well, some scholars divide the chapters sequentially. They argue that verses 1 through 13 refer strictly to the events of the first century leading up to 70 AD.
Okay.
And then they see a hard pivot happening at verse 14, shifting focus to the very end of time.
Okay, that makes sense logically, but I know ancient literature often doesn't read like a modern chronological textbook.
Very true. That is why others see a literary structure known as a chiasm.
A chiasm, what is that?
It is a repeating pattern, like ABAB. In this view, Jesus alternates back and forth, weaving the first century destruction and the end times together thematically rather than strictly chronologically.
I see. That makes the blurring intentional.
Exactly. But the third perspective is perhaps the most profound. It suggests that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD functions as a preview or a type of the final judgment.
So the big takeaway here is that ancient prophecy isn't just a simple crystal ball. It is more like a fractal.
A fractal. I like that.
Yeah, like the small, immediate local disaster, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, is the exact shape and pattern of the massive, ultimate cosmic disaster at the end of time.
Precisely. The local catastrophe is a smaller scale model of the ultimate reality, which brings us directly to how Jesus answers their question about the signs.
Right. What are the signs?
He starts by listing out some pretty intense historical events. He warns them about false messiahs, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes in various places, and famines.
Okay, wait, hold on a second. I have to push back here a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I am a disciple sitting on that mountain and he lists, wars, earthquakes and famines, as signs of the end. Well, those things happen in literally every single century.
Right, they really do.
That is just like a regular Tuesday in the Roman Empire. So how is an earthquake supposed to be a useful warning sign if the ground is shaking all the time anyway?
That is precisely the point Jesus is making, and it is actually brilliant. He is intentionally managing their expectations right from the start.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, he categorizes these common historical catastrophes in a very specific way. He calls them the beginning of birth pains.
Okay, so they are the process, not the actual finale.
Exactly. He is warning them not to be alarmed by standard historical chaos. These disasters are precursors.
Got it.
They are part of the agonizing, ongoing process of the old world passing away, but they are absolutely not the immediate signal of the end. He is essentially telling them, do not panic when history happens. The sky isn't falling just because empires are warring.
That reframes everything. He's basically saying, don't get distracted by the general global chaos, because the real threat you need to worry about is going to be incredibly personal and local.
Yes, because right after this, Jesus pivots from global earthquakes to intense, localized, intimate persecution.
And the warnings here are just severe.
They really are. He tells them point blank. Believers will be handed over to local councils, dragged into synagogues, and forced to stand before governors and kings.
So we are looking at local Jewish courts and Roman political authorities alike. Hostility from every conceivable angle.
Exactly. And the terror isn't just institutional, it is deeply personal. He predicts that families will completely fracture under the pressure of survival.
Yeah, that part is chilling.
Brothers will betray brothers to death. Fathers will betray children, and children will rise up against their parents. Your own family handing you over to an executioner.
The psychological weight of that animosity is almost impossible to grasp.
It is horrific. But paired with this terrifying prediction of total betrayal is a profound promise.
And they really needed a promise right then.
Definitely. Jesus assures them that when they are dragged onto these trial floors, they shouldn't spend an ounce of energy worrying about what defense they are going to mount, because the Holy Spirit will speak through them.
Wow. It is a promise of ultimate divine presence precisely in the moment of total human abandonment.
Yes. So you have global chaos, which is just noise. You have localized persecution, which is the agonizing reality. But then Jesus gives them the actual pivotal warning sign.
The flare in the sky.
Right. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it does not belong.
Yes, the abomination of desolation. This is the critical mechanism of the prophecy.
Yeah.
It is a direct reference to the Old Testament prophet Daniel, specifically chapter 9.
Right. And to understand what Jesus is doing here, we have to peel back the historical layers of that exact phrase.
Because it isn't just a completely new concept he is inventing, right?
Yeah.
It has a deeply traumatizing history for the Jewish people.
It really does. Originally, this phrase pointed back to a horrific, traumatic event in 167 BC.
What happened then?
The Syrian ruler Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Jerusalem, desecrated the Jewish temple, set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus right inside the holy space, and sacrificed a pig on it.
Ugh, just the ultimate unspeakable violation of their faith.
Exactly. That was the historical abomination that caused desolation.
So Jesus is essentially saying, remember that absolute nightmare from a couple hundred years ago? Something exactly like that is going to happen again.
Yes. And following our fractal analogy, many interpreters see this second fulfillment happening in 70 AD.
Right, when the Roman army besieged the city.
Exactly. They slaughtered the inhabitants and brought their pagan eagle standards right into the ruined temple, effectively profaning the holy space once again.
But because of the massive cosmic language that follows in the text, many also see this pointing even further ahead.
Yes. They see it pointing to a future Antichrist figure who will commit an ultimate global act of desecration in the very end times.
And the mechanism of this warning is all about speed, because Jesus' instructions to the people actually living through this are incredibly urgent.
Oh, absolutely urgent. Once they see this specific abomination, whatever form it takes, the time for waiting is over.
Right. He says those in Judea need to flee to the mountains immediately.
The urgency is just absolute. He says if you are lounging on your flat roof, do not even go down the stairs into your house to pack a survival bag.
Wow, just drop everything and run.
Exactly. And if you are working out in the field, do not turn back to grab your heavy coat. The destruction will be so swift and so brutal that any hesitation could be fatal.
That really grounds this highly abstract theological apocalypse into, terrifying physical logistics. I mean, he specifically notes how uniquely horrific this flight will be for vulnerable people.
Right, like pregnant women or nursing mothers.
Yeah, and he urges them to pray that this disaster does not happen in winter. Because, I mean, winter means the rivers are swollen, the valleys are choked with freezing mud, and the roads are basically impassable.
You just can't survive a mountain flight in freezing rain. It highlights that this is a period of unparalleled physical distress.
A tribulation unlike anything since the beginning of creation.
In fact, Jesus says the devastation will be so absolute that if the Lord had not decided to actively shorten the days, no human being on earth would survive.
Wow, literally no one.
Right. But for the sake of the elect, those he has chosen, he has shortened the timeline.
The concept of survival here is fascinating. When you dig into the original language of the text, there was a really interesting Greek word used here, right? Sozo.
Oh, sozo is a brilliant word to study. Generally, in Greek literature, it means to save, to deliver, to preserve, or to keep safe.
Right.
But its usage flexes heavily depending on the exact context.
It is like a linguistic mirror, because sometimes it means pure physical rescue from immediate danger, like literally surviving a Roman siege sword or being cured of a deadly illness.
Yes, physical preservation.
But then, as you move through the New Testament, especially in the epistles, it takes on this massive, eternal spiritual weight. It means salvation in the redemptive sense, being saved from the final judgment of sin.
And the brilliance of using sozo here is that it does both jobs simultaneously. It bridges the physical and the spiritual.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if you are a first-century Christian fleeing Jerusalem in 70 AD, being saved means surviving the siege. But if you are looking at the ultimate end of the world, being saved points to the spiritual preservation of the elect by God's sovereign hand.
Even amidst the total collapse of the universe.
Exactly.
And man, they are going to need that preservation. Because the danger isn't just physical swords or freezing winters. The psychological danger is arguably worse.
It really is. Jesus warns that false Christs and false prophets will appear.
And this is crucial. They won't just be standing on a street corner preaching false doctrines. The text explicitly says they will be performing actual visible signs and wonders.
Right. Their singular goal is to deceive, if possible, even the elect.
It really reminds me of modern deepfake technology, but infinitely more terrifying because it is happening in physical reality.
Oh, that is a great comparison.
Yeah, imagine a deception designed so flawlessly, a visual wonder so convincing that even the most grounded, educated, spiritually mature experts might start second-guessing their own reality.
It would be incredibly disorienting.
You are watching someone perform a literal miracle right in front of your eyes, and you have to have the psychological and spiritual endurance to hold on to the truth that they are a total fraud. That is exhausting.
It is a terrifying test of endurance, and this intense period of deception and unparalleled tribulation is the direct final prelude to the ultimate climax of the discourse.
Right, because the prophecy completely shifts gears from earthly, local desecration to a full-blown cosmic unraveling.
The imagery he uses here is both awe-inspiring and terrifying.
Jesus says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will literally fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken.
The very fabric of the physical universe, the gravity holding everything together, it just begins to collapse.
This is classic heavy prophetic language, right?
It is. It deeply echoes the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah and Joel. The total unmaking of the natural world stands in stark, dramatic contrast to what happens next.
What happens next?
Well, precisely when the cosmos goes completely dark, the Son of Man arrives.
Coming in clouds with great power and glory, it is the ultimate reversal of the narrative.
Exactly. The contrast is staggering. His first arrival was characterized by weakness, humility, obscurity, and ultimately ended on a Roman cross.
Right.
But this return is in unquestionable, visible, undeniable cosmic authority. And upon his arrival, he sends out his angels to gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens.
It is the final, ultimate rescue mission.
Okay, so just picture the disciples for a second. I mean, they have just had their minds completely blown.
Oh, absolutely. It is a massive information overload. Right. They went from looking at beautiful architecture to visions of, 450-ton stones crumbling, massive betrayals, global deception, and literally the stars falling from the sky.
Yeah, and Jesus arriving on the clouds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then Jesus just brings the entire conversation right back down to the dirt. He gives them a really simple, practical, agricultural illustration about how they are supposed to live their lives right now.
Yeah, he pivots to the parable of the fig tree. It is honestly a masterclass in grounding them in observation.
Right.
He says, look at the fig tree. When you see its branches become tender and its leaves start to sprout, you inherently know that summer is near.
Right. It is just a natural sign.
In the exact same way, when you see all these historical signs we've just been discussing, you know that the end is near, right at the door.
But then he drops a phrase that has sparked intense debate for literally 2 millennia.
Oh, yes.
He looks at them and says, I assure you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
The Greek phrase there is he geniohot this generation. And yes, it is one of the most debated phrases in all of biblical literature.
I bet.
Interpreters generally fall into 3 primary camps on how to read this.
And let's be careful to walk through these impartially, because each view really changes how you read the timeline. So what is the first camp?
Right. First, you have scholars who argue that this generation refers strictly to the literal contemporaries of Jesus, the exact people who were alive right then, breathing the air, listening to him speak.
Okay, so in this view, all these things refers entirely to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which did in fact happen within their natural lifetime.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense for the local destruction. But what if generation doesn't mean the people standing right there? Because the stars certainly didn't fall from the sky in 70 AD. What is the second view?
The second interpretation looks at the flexibility of that Greek word, genia. It argues that it can actually mean a race or a lineage. So in this view, Jesus is making a sweeping promise that the Jewish people, or perhaps humanity as a whole, will survive and will not be entirely wiped out before his return, despite all the catastrophic wars and cosmic events he just described.
That is a very different angle.
Yeah.
And the third camp?
The third major interpretation shifts the focus to the future. It suggests that this generation refers to the specific future generation that actually witnesses the beginning of the final end-time signs.
Essentially, Jesus is saying that once the final sequence of events actually kicks off, the generation alive at that exact time will see it through to the end.
Right. It won't be a process dragged out over multiple centuries.
It is genuinely fascinating how one single phrase can act as a prism for such vastly different interpretations.
It really is. But honestly, regardless of how you personally interpret this generation, Jesus immediately follows it up with an absolute, undeniable, concrete statement about his own authority.
Right, and the timeline. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
And then he drops this massive caveat. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father.
Wow.
It is a profound, voluntary statement of limitation. He just spent an hour giving them a detailed list of signs and precursors to watch for, yet he explicitly denies anyone the ability to calculate the exact date on a calendar.
Not even the angels know.
Right, and remarkably, in his incarnate human state, Jesus says even he does not know. Only God the Father holds the precise moment.
That creates such a fascinating psychological tension for the listener.
It really does.
He essentially says, pay incredibly close attention to the signs so you know the season, but absolutely do not try to guess the exact time.
It is this brilliant, difficult balance of acute awareness and humble uncertainty. You have to be totally awake, but you have to admit that you do not hold the stopwatch.
And that precise tension is exactly what drives the final urgent command of the entire discourse. He concludes with a short parable about a master who leaves his house and goes on a long journey.
Right, the master puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned daily task, and he gives strict, explicit orders to the porter, the doorkeeper, to stay awake and keep watch.
Because the master could return at any unpredictable moment. Jesus specifically lists the 4 Roman military watches of the night.
Right.
Evening, midnight, rooster crow, or morning.
And think about what it means to be awake at rooster crow. That is the absolute darkest, coldest, most exhausting part of the night.
Definitely. But the mandate is incredibly simple. Watch, do not let the master come suddenly and find you sleeping on the job.
The primary point here isn't about setting dates. It is about the permanent state of readiness required of Jesus' followers.
Right.
The exact timing of the end is hidden from us, but the suddenness of it is absolutely guaranteed. Therefore, the only logical, rational response is a state of constant active vigilance.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to carry into your week. We have talked about massive 450-ton stones. We have talked about fractal timelines, the terror of deep fake-level deception, and the profound mystery of the cosmic timeline.
We have covered a lot of ground today.
We have. But ultimately, all of this theology distills down to the role of that single porter standing at the door in the cold.
Yeah, that is what it all comes down to.
If you actually internalize that Porter mentality, if you wake up and live with the persistent, active vigilance that the Master could return at any moment, whether it is evening, midnight, or tomorrow morning, how does that completely rewire your daily life?
That is the big question.
How does it change the anxiety you feel during your morning commute? How does it reorder your financial priorities? Or even just how you treat the difficult people around you today? Because if the end is sudden, the present moment is infinitely valuable. It is a massive concept to chew on.
It truly is. It changes the entire perspective from one of passive, fearful waiting into one of active, faithful, purposeful living.
Exactly. Well, that wraps up our incredibly deep exploration of Mark chapter 13. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
Yeah, it has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being here with us.
As we close out, we want to remind you that God blesses all the listeners. Take care of yourselves, stay vigilant, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.